Hello, Medscape. This is Mark Lewis. I'm coming to you from my office in the month of March. Now, you may be watching this at a later date, but the reason I wanted to apply that timestamp is March is colon and rectal cancer awareness month. And this month, because it's happening on the heels of the NordICC trial, which attempted to establish the benefit, specifically the mortality benefit, of screening colonoscopy. And I think in its wake has caused a lot of controversy, a lot of, frankly, questions to be asked rightly as we enter this month and really grapple with this as a public health problem. So the first thing I would say is it's crucial we continue to distinguish screening and diagnosis. The diagnostic part is key. If you are having a problem, say blood in the stool, and you're under the traditional age of screening, that's a diagnostic dilemma. And frankly, none of this language around screening should apply to you. I think obviously the pretest probability there is substantially higher that something is wrong. Now that could turn out to be something entirely benign and say hemorrhoidal. But we can't presume that. We can't keep presuming that in all of these young people who appear in our offices with advanced stage colorectal cancer. I've often said, and I'll repeat it now, a medical oncologist is the last type of physician that should be encountering these patients. Now, when we talk about prevention is an interesting word. I sometimes worry that it's an absolute. Like, if we did everything right, and if the patients did everything right, whatever that means, there would be no colorectal cancer. I think what we're looking at instead is risk mitigation and trying actually to incur a stage down migration whereby when we do diagnose these diseases, we're finding them earlier, which again, in some instances can obviate the need for a medical oncologist like myself. So I think that's a very, very important observation. The second thing I wanted to say is it is crucial, I think, to examine some of the salient differences between the Northern European practices that were studied in NordICC and the American population that many of you listening to this will be caring for. So one of the things that was interesting is this was really a study looking at what was the uptake of invitation to screening colonoscopy. Many words have been written, both in the initial paper and in subsequent responses and correspondence to England Journal of Medicine, about this whole invitation. And in fairness to investigators, they actually budgeted for this, or I should say accounted for this in their statistical design. They had estimated that half, 50%, if invitees would follow through on screening colonoscopy, the actually absolute number was 42%. And it was very, very interesting because one of the sort of critiques that came through the New England Journal, I'll read it to you, said this cannot examine the 58% of patients who could benefit from screening colonoscopy. And I think that's a fair point. The other thing that I think is slightly technical and had frankly to be explained to me by gastroenterologists is this whole notion of adenoma detection rate. And again, there's been a lot of sort of back and forth about what's reasonable to expect of a gastroenterologist, what's reasonable to expect of a gastroenterologist in the United States versus in Europe. And what many of my colleagues in GI have noted is that they thought or interpreted the ADR rate in NordICC was lower than they would have considered acceptable. So almost 30% of the endoscopists in NordICC had an ADR, which again is sort of a threshold for detection, adenoma detection rate, of under 25%. And I think the reason some of my GI colleagues found this so alarming is there's a trade-off there between the operator who is having their ADR measured and then the impact of that on the patients that they are testing, or in this case, screening. So one of the studies that was again cited in this dialogue back and forth said that a 1 percentage point increase in ADR is actually associated with a 3% reduction in future incidence of colorectal cancer and a 5% reduction in colorectal cancer-related death. So again, I think that's important to consider, and I think we do need to hold endoscopists, and again, they have a hard job, to a acceptable ADR rate. And again, as with any continuous variable, we can argue about where that cut point should be, and in fairness, it's probably not a strict binary. The last thing I have to say, though, is the colonoscopy, to have an impact on mortality, has to be done. And I realize, again, that the investigators were asking a slightly different question, although they actually say in their reply in the New England Journal the Nordic trial was not designed to assess population participation in colonoscopy screening. And I think the reason this is so important is that colonoscopy can only affect mortality, in my opinion, or mostly affect mortality if it's interrupting the adenoma to carcinoma sequence. And this is where colonoscopy, frankly, has an advantage over even fecal screening, is that, yes, a fecal screen might be highly appropriate, depending on the situation, the resources. But first of all, a positive fecal screen is incomplete as a screen until the scope that follows. And secondly, it's only the scope that can find that polyp and remove the polyp and then interrupt physically its development, its oncogenesis. So I do think there's something to be said for colonoscopy above and beyond fecal testing. And the last thing I think we have to reconcile is we've actually known for many years that there can be a mortality benefit to patients undergoing flexible sigmoidoscopy. So now I wonder if we're sort of converging with the trends of colorectal cancer. Now, rectal, of course, by definition, is distal, but even colorectal cancer in general seems to be shifting towards the left in distal colon. And so it makes me wonder if flexible sigmoidoscopy has a benefit because it's actually capturing more of the cancer on that side, if you will. And it's hard for me to understand why flex sig would confer mortality benefit for colonoscopy does not. I just have a hard time reconciling that in my head. And so I think we need to think very critically about all these things. Bottom line is, I don't think the perfect should be the enemy of the good. I personally am not yet ready, as I think you can tell, to jettison recommendations of screening colonoscopy to my patients. And I think as we move forward, that the final distinction in performing these procedures is around sedation. So a lot of my American colleagues have noted that the sedation rate in Nordic was actually quite low. And I want to make sure I quote this correctly. I think that the rate of sedation was somewhere in the low 20s. And one of my colleagues here said, it's extremely difficult to properly interrogate the whole colon and remove polyps if the patient's uncomfortable. And I think that stands to reason. So again, not a critique of the Nordic investigators. I think they did an admirable job at a very, very large scale to conduct this trial in a number of Northern European countries. But I do think the practice pattern difference between Europe and America vis-a-vis sedation is important to consider too. So bottom line, I want people to be properly screened for colorectal cancer. There's a whole separate video, I think, around the age that should first occur. But as far as Nordic's concerned, I don't think it's the death knell for colonoscopy in this country. And I would urge people to remain a part of this dialectic. That's how we move things forward. It's okay that we disagree. We should do it rationally and civilly and ultimately realize that our mutual interest is helping our patients. We don't want to incur iatrogenic harm. We also don't want to miss opportunities to intervene earlier in the adenoma to carcinoma sequence. So with that, I wish you all good health, especially good colon health. And this GI oncologist hopes this finds you happy and healthy. Take care. Thank you.